You'll remember that when the Portuguese started coming into Africa, they wanted to trade in gold and spices. But then they discovered that there was another commodity, the human being. And it is interesting that even the now very quiet European powers were involved in what later became the transatlantic triangle of slavery. The Danes were there. If you look at the Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, in what is today Ghana, they participated in the building of it. The Swedes were there. The Norwegians were there. The Dutch were there. The British were there. The French were there. The Spaniards were there. The Germans were there.
Why do students graduate knowing the names of Columbus and Caesar, but not Mansa Musa or the builders of Great Zimbabwe? Why are Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. remembered, while Ella Baker and Bayard Rustin are erased? Why do textbooks celebrate American progress, yet bury the destruction of Tulsa's Black Wall Street or Rosewood? This is not an accident, it is erasure. But who first decided what stories would be told and which would be buried? Let's find that out. The truth is chilling. Classrooms across the United States and much of the Western world have been designed to forget. The erasure of Black memory is not a side effect of history education. It is its architecture. For generations, children have sat at desks and absorbed a carefully curated story of the past that places whiteness at the center and everything else at the margins. In that story, Black people appear only as enslaved victims, protestors in the 1960s, or footnotes in the struggle for democracy. Rarely do they appear as builders of empires, strategists of movements, or creators of thriving towns. This omission matters. History is not just about the past. It is a weapon that shapes how people see themselves today. When schools bury Black memory, they do more than erase names and dates. They deny Black children the pride of seeing their heritage reflected in greatness. They teach white children to unconsciously believe that progress, civilization, and power have always belonged to people who look like them. And they condition society at large to misunderstand racism, to see it as a glitch solved long ago, rather than a system that is alive and mutating. Think about the silence. For decades, American students in Tulsa graduated without ever hearing that their city was once home to the wealthiest Black community in the country, and that it was destroyed by racist terror. Generations of British students learned about the glories of empire without ever hearing that African kingdoms they colonized had universities, complex governance systems, and artistic achievements that rivaled Europe's. Silence does not just happen. Silence is engineered. But why silence Black history in the first place? The answer lies not only in what stories are told, but in the power those stories hold. If you admit that Africa had empires as advanced as Europe, then the justification for colonization collapses. If you admit that Black towns in America thrived economically, then the narrative of Black dependency crumbles. If you admit that the civil rights movement was powered by grassroots organizers, women, and LGBTQ activists, then you challenge the myth that progress is handed down by a few great men. In short, telling the truth disrupts the hierarchy. That is why erasure is not random, it is strategic. What makes this theft of memory even more insidious is how normal it feels. A child can pass through 12 years of school, sit through dozens of history classes, ace exams, and still never be told that their textbooks have been lying by omission. They will believe they have received a full education when in reality they have inherited only fragments. That is how power protects itself, not just through violence, but through selective storytelling. And here lies the haunting question. If the erasure is this deep, then who orchestrated it? Whose hands shaped the textbooks, cut out the names, and rewrote the past so that millions of students would never know the truth? The answer leads us into the shadowy corridors of curriculum boards, textbook committees, and political organizations that understood early on that controlling the past meant controlling the future. The late 19th century was a turning point. The Reconstruction era had briefly allowed a vision of America where formerly enslaved people could enter politics, own land, and shape communities. But once federal troops withdrew from the South, white elites moved quickly to regain dominance, not only through laws and violence, but through ideas. They realized that teaching children a white-centered version of history could ensure that generations would grow up seeing racial hierarchy as natural. The classroom became as important as the courthouse or the lynching tree in maintaining white supremacy. Organizations such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy played a key role. These women weren't simply tending to graves or preserving family memories. They were drafting detailed measuring rods for school books. Their instructions to publishers were clear: present slavery as benign, portray enslaved Africans as loyal, and frame the Confederacy as a noble lost cause rather than a rebellion to preserve human bondage. Publishers eager to secure contracts in the South obeyed, quietly erasing names like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman from textbooks and softening the brutality of slavery into vague references to labor. The scale of the manipulation was staggering. By the 1920s and 1930s, surveys showed that Southern students could complete 12 years of schooling without encountering a single named black historical figure. But the distortion didn't stop at omission. Some textbooks went further, openly glorifying the Ku Klux Klan as defenders of order and morality. For white children, this created pride in their heritage. For black children, it created alienation, reinforcing that they did not belong in the story of the nation. The motives behind this erasure were both ideological and economic. On one hand, white elites wanted to preserve racial dominance by naturalizing it through education. On the other hand, textbook publishers were corporations. To sell in the largest markets, especially the South, they had to comply with the demands of segregationist boards. In other words, erasure was profitable. Catering to white anxieties meant steady contracts. Telling the truth about slavery or Reconstruction, by contrast, could get a textbook banned. This manipulation wasn't confined to the South. Northern states often adopted the same textbooks because they were mass-produced for national distribution. Thus, even children in places like Ohio or Massachusetts were fed the Confederate-influenced narrative. Over time, this created a national consensus. History belonged to white men, while black people appeared only at the margins. And this pattern wasn't uniquely American. Across the Atlantic, colonial powers were engaged in their rewriting projects. Just as the U.S. buried Reconstruction, Britain rewrote its imperial history to portray colonialism as benevolent, erasing the voices of the colonized. In both cases, the guiding principle was the same: tell a story that flatters power, bury the evidence of exploitation, and deny the possibility of equality. So, the answer to our question, who decides what history gets told, is clear. It was not historians, but power brokers, white supremacist organizations, state boards, and publishers motivated by politics and profit. They understood that history was not neutral. It was a tool of control. But this raises the next question. If erasure was so deeply woven into the system from the beginning, what exactly did it erase? What great stories of black civilization, achievement, and resilience were deliberately buried under the weight of textbooks and patriotic myths? The answer lies in the kingdoms and empires of Africa, vast, sophisticated civilizations that rivaled or surpassed Europe in wealth, scholarship, and statecraft. Their omission was not carelessness, it was strategic, because to teach them would have shattered the myth that Africa was primitive and in need of European guidance. Consider the Mali Empire of West Africa. At its height in the 14th century, Mali controlled vast trade networks stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Sahara. Gold from Mali financed economies across the Mediterranean, while the empire's most famous ruler, Mansa Musa, became legendary for his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, distributing so much gold along the way that he disrupted markets for years. But Mali was not merely wealthy, it was intellectual. Timbuktu became a beacon of learning, home to the University of Sankore, and libraries filled with manuscripts on astronomy, law, and philosophy. To include this story in Western textbooks would have forced a comparison. While Europe was crawling out of the Middle Ages, Africa was producing scholars and wealth that shaped the world. The silence around Mali was therefore intentional because a proud, literate, wealthy Africa would undermine the narrative of white superiority. Further south, Great Zimbabwe stood as another rebuke to colonial myths. From the 11th to the 15th centuries, the Shona people built a sprawling stone city with intricate dry stone walls, towers, and enclosures, all without mortar. Archaeological evidence shows that Great Zimbabwe was a center of international trade. Chinese porcelain, Persian glass, and Arabian coins flowed through its markets in exchange for gold and ivory. Yet when European colonists stumbled upon its ruins in the 19th century, they refused to believe black Africans had built it. Instead, they fabricated theories crediting Phoenicians, Arabs, or other outsiders. Why? Because acknowledging Great Zimbabwe as an African achievement would collapse the racist logic that justified colonization. The colonial regime in Rhodesia went so far as to suppress evidence, censor reports, and propagate lies for decades. Even today, Great Zimbabwe is rarely included in school curricula outside Africa. The erasure served its purpose. Generations grew up believing sub-Saharan Africa had no history worth telling. Then there is the Kingdom of Benin in present-day Nigeria. When Portuguese traders arrived in the 15th century, they were stunned by Benin City's grandeur, broad streets, complex urban planning, and a royal palace decorated with ivory and bronze. The Benin bronzes, intricately cast plaques and statues, were masterpieces of artistry and historical record, depicting the kingdom's rulers, warriors, and rituals. Yet in 1897, the British launched a punitive expedition, burned Benin City, and looted thousands of artworks. These treasures were scattered across European museums, while the story of the kingdom itself was left untold. In textbooks, the Benin bronzes are sometimes shown as anonymous African art, stripped of context. The kingdom that produced them and the violence of its destruction is buried. To remember Benin in full would require admitting that African states were politically sophisticated, artistically advanced, and capable of diplomacy, and that Europe destroyed them out of greed. These three examples are only fragments of what was silenced. Ghana, Songhai, Axum, and the Swahili Coast city-states all reveal a continent with a long record of innovation, trade, and governance. Yet Western education teaches Africa as a blank slate until Europeans arrive. The omission was not accidental. It was a colonial strategy designed to convince both Europeans and Africans that domination was justified, that there was nothing of value before colonization. This raises another problem. If the histories of entire empires could be erased so thoroughly, what happens to more recent histories? What about the struggles of African Americans within the United States, whose victories and sacrifices have also been selectively forgotten or sanitized? The answer is evident in how the civil rights movement is presented in classrooms today. Rather than a raw, complicated struggle driven by countless ordinary people, it has been compressed into a handful of safe heroes and a few carefully chosen moments. What students receive is not history. It is a morality play, scrubbed of its sharp edges and political fire. The version most Americans know goes something like this. Rosa Parks, a tired seamstress, refused to give up her seat. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a dream. And then America redeemed itself by passing civil rights laws in the 1960s. The curtain falls with victory, leaving the impression that the story is over. This narrative is tidy, uplifting, and patriotic. It is also a distortion. The first distortion is the reduction of the movement to a handful of individuals. Parks is stripped of her identity as a trained activist working for years within the NACP, transformed instead into a lone symbol of polite defiance. King is quoted endlessly for his dream of racial harmony, but rarely for his fiery critiques of economic inequality, militarism, or white moderates who demanded patience. The deeper context that these leaders were part of vast networks of organizers, strategists, and grassroots communities is erased. By focusing only on charismatic figures, the textbooks hide the collective power of ordinary black citizens who risked jobs, safety, and lives. The second distortion is the sanitization of radicalism. The civil rights movement was not only about polite marches and inspiring speeches. It involved sit-ins, boycotts, jail-ins, freedom rides, voter registration drives under threat of death, and often brutal confrontations with state power. Students rarely learn that activists faced fire hoses, police dogs, beatings, and assassinations not just in the Deep South, but across the nation. Even more hidden are the radical wings of the movement, the calls for economic justice, for black political power, and community self-defense. Sanitization transforms a revolutionary struggle into a story of gradual, peaceful change, which flatters the nation while erasing the costs borne by those who fought. The third distortion is the premature ending of the story. In most curricula, the civil rights movement ends in 1968 with the assassination of King. The impression left is that racism was defeated, civil rights were secured, and America became the colorblind society it always promised to be. But the real history tells a different story, that the 1970s saw a backlash, that black power movements challenged ongoing inequality, and that structural racism persisted in housing, policing, and prisons. By drawing the curtain early, schools conceal the continuity of struggle and leave students unprepared to understand why racial injustice still defines the present. Why does this sanitized version persist? Because it is politically convenient. A narrative that celebrates King's dream but silences his demand for economic justice allows America to feel proud without feeling guilty. A narrative that highlights Rosa Parks's single act of defiance but ignores the organized networks behind her makes history look accidental rather than planned. A narrative that ends in triumph absolves society of responsibility to continue the struggle. In short, the sanitized civil rights movement functions like the erasure of African kingdoms. It reassures the powerful by burying the full truth. But buried beneath this simplified tale are the names and lives of activists whose contributions were indispensable, yet whose stories rarely make it into textbooks. If the official curriculum clings to King and Parks as its heroes, who are the forgotten architects still waiting to be remembered? Here's a quick reminder. Please like, share, and subscribe to Black Culture Unlocked for powerful Black news, real stories of our heroes and leaders, and the rich culture and history the world tried to forget. If schools flatten the civil rights movement into a neat tale of King's dream and Parks' bus seat, then the deeper theft is this. The architects who built the foundation of that movement are made invisible. Their names are rarely mentioned, their strategies rarely explained, and their sacrifices rarely honored. To tell their stories would complicate the sanitized narrative, revealing that change came not from lone heroes, but from networks of visionaries who were often women, queer, poor, or rural. Take Ella Baker, often called the godmother of the movement. Baker was not a charismatic preacher delivering speeches to thousands. She was an organizer, a mentor, a strategist. Her genius lay in seeing power not in a single leader, but in collective leadership. She nurtured young activists in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, teaching them that strong people do not need strong leaders. Her fingerprints are everywhere in the sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration drives of the 1960s, yet she is missing from most textbooks. Why? Because Baker's model of decentralized leadership threatened the narrative America prefers, that change comes from great men at the top, not ordinary people at the bottom. Then there is Bayard Rustin, the brilliant tactician who organized the 1963 March on Washington, the very stage where King gave his most famous speech. Rustin introduced King to Gandhian nonviolence, trained activists in disciplined resistance, and planned logistics on a scale so massive it remains one of the most successful demonstrations in U.S. history. Yet Rustin's name was erased for decades. His sexuality, which was openly gay at a time when that invited persecution, made him a target both inside and outside the movement. Leaders who feared controversy pushed him to the shadows, and history books followed their lead. The result is that millions of students learn about King's dream, but never meet the man who built the platform on which that dream was spoken. And then there is Fannie Lou Hamer, a sharecropper's daughter turned fearless voice of grassroots democracy. Hamer endured beatings, jailings, and relentless intimidation for daring to register black voters in Mississippi. In 1964, she electrified the nation at the Democratic National Convention when she demanded that her integrated Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party be seated instead of the state's all-white delegation. Her testimony about racist terror was so powerful that President Lyndon Johnson scrambled to call a press conference to block the television coverage. Yet even Johnson could not erase her words. They reached homes across America and helped push the Voting Rights Act forward. But Hamer, too, is often reduced to a quote, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," rather than remembered as the relentless strategist she was. These are only 3 names among countless others. Septima Clark, who pioneered citizenship schools to teach literacy and rights. Diane Nash, a student leader who shaped the Freedom Rides. Gloria Richardson, who led militant protests in Cambridge, Maryland. Their absence is not coincidental. To include them would show that the movement was diverse, radical, and driven by ordinary people. To erase them preserves the myth that progress was neat, inevitable, and safely controlled by the few. The consequence of forgetting these architects is profound. Students are taught to admire polished icons, but not to see themselves as potential changemakers. They are told freedom was gifted, not fought for in countless kitchens, churches, and jail cells by people whose names never made the evening news. Restoring these figures to the story restores agency to history itself. But this leads to a bigger question. If individuals could be erased so completely, what about entire communities? What happens when not just names, but whole towns built, burned, and buried disappear from the nation's memory? If Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, and Fannie Lou Hamer could be written out of history, then it is not surprising that entire communities could be made to vanish as well. But while erasing individuals hides the architects of change, erasing towns conceals something even more dangerous: the fact that Black people built thriving economies, self-sufficient societies, and centers of culture in the face of oppression. To acknowledge these towns would be to admit that Black success was not only possible but real, and that it was deliberately destroyed. The Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, is the most infamous example. In the early 20th century, Greenwood was a beacon of Black prosperity. Doctors, lawyers, newspapers, theaters, and hotels lined its streets. Black wealth circulated within the community, creating a rare island of economic independence in a sea of segregation. But in 1921, this success provoked one of the most brutal acts of racial terror in U.S. history. Over 2 days, white mobs, many deputized by local authorities, burned 35 blocks of Greenwood to the ground, killing as many as 300 residents and leaving thousands homeless. For decades, survivors were silenced, and schools across Oklahoma taught nothing of the massacre. Some textbooks referred vaguely to a riot, shifting blame onto the victims. Generations grew up in Tulsa without knowing that their city had once hosted one of the wealthiest Black communities in America. Rosewood, Florida met a similar fate in 1923. Sparked by a false accusation against a black man, white mobs destroyed the small, majority black town. Homes were torched, residents murdered, and the survivors scattered. Rosewood was so thoroughly erased that it became a ghost town, abandoned to weeds and silence. It was not until the 1980s, when survivors broke their silence, that the truth resurfaced. In 1994, Florida passed a law requiring schools to teach African American history, partly in acknowledgement of the cover-up of Rosewood. Yet even today, the depth of Rosewood's destruction is rarely explored in classrooms. Students may hear it mentioned in passing, if at all. The message is clear. Black prosperity met with white violence is a story too disruptive for polite textbooks. But not every black town was destroyed by mobs. Some, like Nicodemus, Kansas, founded by formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction, struggled against economic decline and dwindling populations. Others, like Allensworth in California or Blackdom in New Mexico, thrived for a time before collapsing under the weight of systemic neglect, lack of infrastructure, limited access to credit, and discriminatory policies. Their histories show that black ambition was not limited to cities or the South. Black settlers were pioneers, homesteaders, and builders of entire communities across the American landscape. Yet these towns are often invisible in narratives of westward expansion, where pioneers are assumed to be white. To erase these places is to erase the diversity of American settlement itself. The destruction of black neighborhoods did not always come from mobs or economic isolation. In the mid-20th century, many flourishing black business districts in cities like Durham, Richmond, and Atlanta were demolished under the banner of urban renewal. Highways were deliberately routed through black neighborhoods, displacing thousands and shattering local economies. What violence did not burn, policy bulldozed. Yet in most classrooms, urban renewal is presented as modernization, with little mention of whose communities were sacrificed. The pattern is unmistakable. Where black communities built success, something came to tear it down, and then schools came to bury the evidence. The omission is not accidental. To admit that thriving black economies existed would force America to face a harder truth: that systemic racism was not only about oppression, but also about the deliberate destruction of black prosperity. So the question follows: if entire towns can be wiped from the map and then from memory, who benefits from that silence? Who decides what is left in the textbooks and what is left out? In the United States, education standards are controlled at the state level, giving immense power to state governments and boards of education. This decentralization means that history is not simply history, it is politics. A single state's decision can ripple across the nation, especially when that state is a major textbook buyer. Texas, for example, has long exerted outsized influence on the industry. Because of its enormous school population, publishers design textbooks to meet Texas standards, knowing that whatever passes, there will be profitable nationwide. This economic incentive encourages publishers to play it safe, soften controversial language, skip over painful truths, and present history in ways that will not provoke political backlash. The results are sometimes shocking. In 2015, a Texas-approved geography textbook described the Atlantic slave trade as a system that brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. The word slaves vanished, replaced by workers. The violence of human bondage was reframed as voluntary labor. Only after a parent exposed the page on social media did the publisher, McGraw-Hill, issue an apology. But the real scandal was not that the euphemism slipped through. The scandal was that dozens of reviewers, educators, and officials saw it and let it stand. That moment revealed the quiet consensus at work: better to avoid discomfort, even if it means distorting reality. This kind of distortion is not confined to one state. Across the country, political battles rage over what is appropriate to teach. Since 2021, Lawmakers in at least 44 states have introduced bills to restrict teaching about race and racism. 18 have passed laws or rules banning so-called divisive concepts. Florida's Stop Woke Act is the most infamous, forbidding any teaching that might make students feel guilt or discomfort over past racial injustices. On paper, such laws sound neutral. In practice, they intimidate teachers into avoiding basic facts about slavery, segregation, or systemic racism. The chilling effect is powerful. Why risk a career-ending controversy by teaching about Jim Crow when you can simply skip it? Textbook companies, for their part, are not neutral victims of politics. They are active players. To maximize profits, they tailor content to the broadest and least controversial standards, often preemptively removing topics that might be flagged in conservative states. Discussions of redlining, mass incarceration, or black radical thought rarely make it into mainstream textbooks, not because scholars haven't written about them, but because publishers fear political rejection. In this way, economic self-interest reinforces ideological erasure. The problem is not limited to the United States. In Britain, curriculum changes in 2014 emphasized national pride and minimized colonial violence. The official story of the empire became one of railroads, education, and order, while the extraction of wealth, forced labor, and massacres were downplayed or ignored. Like in the US, the political motive was clear: to present history as something to be proud of, not something to wrestle with. And like in the US, publishers complied, creating textbooks that celebrated the empire while burying its victims. What emerges is a picture of erasure as policy, not accident. Politicians want patriotic unity, publishers want sales, school boards want to avoid controversy. Together, they build a curriculum that flatters power and suppresses memory. The result is a textbook that teaches about Abraham Lincoln, but not about Black Wall Street, that mentions Martin Luther King Jr., but not Ella Baker, that includes the Boston Tea Party, but not the Rosewood Massacre. It is a curriculum of comfort, not truth. But what happens when this comfort becomes the national memory? What is the price of raising generation after generation in a sanitized history where brutality is softened, victories are simplified, and whole communities are invisible? The pen that edits textbooks, as we've seen, may serve political power and economic interest, but erasure is never a neutral act. It reshapes how people see themselves, their neighbors, and their nation. The price of this silence is staggering, not just for Black students, but for society as a whole. When a child opens a history book and sees page after page filled with white inventors, white generals, white leaders, they learn more than just names and dates. They learn who matters. They absorb an unspoken hierarchy. Whiteness as the engine of civilization, blackness as peripheral or absent. For Black students, this absence can feel like an obliteration of possibility. If people who look like you never appear except as victims, what space is left for you in the story of progress? It is a theft not just of memory, but of identity. For non-Black students, the cost is different, but equally corrosive. Erasure denies them the chance to encounter a truer, fuller account of their society. Without stories of Black agency and resistance, they inherit myths of inevitable progress. Slavery ended, segregation fell, and racism vanished. They may genuinely believe inequality today is accidental or exaggerated because their textbooks never explain the policies, laws, and violence that shaped the present. In this way, silence breeds ignorance, and ignorance breeds indifference. The civic consequences are even deeper. A democracy depends on informed citizens, but how informed can we be if we don't know the ground we stand on? How can we debate solutions to racial disparities if we have no memory of how those disparities were engineered? Consider the myth of meritocracy in America. The idea that anyone can succeed through hard work alone. It becomes harder to question this myth if you never learned about redlining, about towns burned for their prosperity, about laws that barred Black families from accumulating wealth. Silence, in this case, is not just ignorance, it is consent to injustice. Erasure also warps collective memory, producing what some scholars call the national fairy tale. In this story, America is born in liberty, stumbles with slavery, redeems itself in the Civil War, falters again with segregation, and then finally triumphs with Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Act. The tale ends in victory, suggesting the work is complete. What's missing is the messier reality. The persistence of inequality, the grassroots leaders who never made it into the spotlight, the unfinished fights for justice. By cutting history into neat chapters of sin and redemption, erasure anesthetizes the past. It makes it safe, comfortable, and toothless. The silence also leaves wounds unhealed. Generations of Black families have carried stories of massacres, lynchings, or stolen land that never made it into school lessons. This creates a double injury. First, the violence itself, then the denial of that violence in the public record. Imagine being a descendant of Tulsa or Rosewood survivors, sitting in a classroom where your teacher has no idea your history even exists. The trauma is compounded by invisibility. Without acknowledgement, healing stalls. And yet, the silence is not absolute. Cracks have always appeared. Through oral history, family memory, and community education, Black churches, cultural centers, and grassroots initiatives have kept stories alive, even when schools refused. But the price of relying on these alternative spaces is inequality of knowledge. Only those who seek it or who inherit it directly gain access. Public education, which should be the shared foundation of civic understanding, becomes a tool of division. The danger is not only in what students don't know, but in what fills the void. When textbooks omit truths, myths rush in to take their place. Slavery wasn't that bad. Segregation was just separate but equal. The civil rights movement solved everything. These are not harmless misunderstandings. They are distortions that shape voting patterns, public policy, and interpersonal relationships. A society that builds its identity on partial truths will eventually find its foundation cracking. The cost of silence, then, is not just historical, it is present and future. It shapes how young people imagine themselves, how citizens understand justice, and how a nation grapples with its past. And so the question becomes urgent. If the erasure is this costly, how do we begin to restore what has been stolen? How do we repair the fractures in our collective memory and build an education that tells the whole story? We repair the fractures in our collective memory by first acknowledging that history has been deliberately edited, with entire chapters, African kingdoms, Black-owned towns, indigenous struggles, and working-class movements erased to uphold systems of power. Repair begins with restoring what was silenced, weaving suppressed voices, documents, oral traditions, and cultural memories back into classrooms, museums, and public discourse. It means building an education that does not glorify conquest and oppression as progress, but instead tells the whole story, one that is honest about atrocities, yet celebrates resistance, innovation, and resilience. This requires rewriting curricula, training teachers to engage with uncomfortable truths, and empowering communities to be co-authors of their history. Only then can education transform from a tool of erasure into one of liberation, ensuring future generations inherit a memory that is whole, truthful, and just. Why do schools erase the real history of Black kingdoms and leaders? Who benefits when Black memory is buried? Let us know in the comment section. How much longer will we let others write our story for us? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it, because here we tell the stories no one else will. From ancient African civilizations to modern Black excellence, we reveal the truth, the power, and the legacy they tried to erase. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.